times over the course of the next 10 weeks. Okay, so this is like just broad, start getting you familiar with the language and terminology, seeing the structures, the major parts of it. And then when we get to later on, when we start getting in more depth into the cerebrum or into the brainstem or into the spinal cord, we'll really dive in deep to these areas. Today is just a very broad overview of gross structure of the nervous system. Okay? All right. As long as the brain is a mystery, the universe, the reflection of the structure of the brain will also be a mystery. I mean, you think about that's true. I mean, the universe, the way we perceive the universe is limited by our own brain. Until we understand the brain, it's hard to understand the universe. And we only know, such a small amount about the brain right now. But with the new technology, it's rapidly, that's rapidly changing. This was Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who's a famous neuroscientist from Spain back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. You'll see actually he was very good at histology, and he did a lot of histology looking at cell structure of the nervous system, specifically the cerebellum. So it's really cool. The Purkinje cell, he kind of found the Purkinje cell, which we'll talk about later. All right, neuroscience, what is it? Relatively new science concerned with the development, chemistry, structure, function, pathology of the nervous system. Really all the new imaging studies that we have, new ways to look at EEGs, the ability to do PET scans and functional MRI has really opened up this field of neuroscience, of understanding how the nervous system works and communicates with each other and functions. So there's lots of different areas of neuroscience. We're going to focus mainly on clinical neuroscience, and we're specifically going to focus more on how the nervous system controls motor function and also how sensory and motor function are our two biggest areas that we're going to talk about. I wish I knew or had the time and energy to learn more about cognition and memory and sleep and personality and all that kind of stuff, because that is actually really, really fascinating. But we just don't have the time to go there. So we're really going to focus in on the motor, sensory, autonomic function, things that affect movement, exercise, those kind of things is what we're going to spend most of our time focusing on. This is the overall organization of the course, and it's kind of how your schedule is broken out in the readings and so forth. There's kind of several distinct areas. The first is really looking at this big structural overview today and tomorrow. Then we'll talk about more the cellular level, physiology at the cellular level, the neuron, the glial cells, action potentials, and then development of the nervous system. So we'll talk about that and have an exam on that next Friday. Then we'll get into these functional systems like the motor system and sensory systems and autonomic system. Then we'll start going through more of a regional look at the nervous system, cerebrum, brainstem, spinal cord, peripheral nervous system, regional look. And then we'll also talk about some special functions like primarily vision and vestibular system is what we'll focus on there. And then support systems, blood supply and the ventricular system and the meninges, the coverings in the nervous system. So that's kind of how we're going to go through. There's some overlap on these too, okay? So, tidbits, facts, little couple of interesting tidbits and facts. Human brain weighs about 3 pounds, about 2% of our body weight. You look at an elephant though, 13 pounds. They have a 13-pound brain, but it really only is 0.3% of their body weight. So relative to a percentage of our body weight, humans have pretty big brains, compared to our body weight. This is really mind-boggling. You have 100 billion neurons in your nervous system, okay? Your peripheral and central nervous systems combined. And if you if you pulled each neuron out and laid it side by side, not necessarily even end to end, just side by side, they would go 600 miles if you teased out every neuron, just laid it side by side and laid it out in one long line, about 600 miles, just so crazy. You have 1 quadrillion synapses, so that's how your neurons communicate, or neurons communicate is through these synapses, and that's 500 million per cubic millimeter. So when you look just a cubic millimeter within the brain, especially in the cortex there, you could have up to 500 million connections or synapses between those cells. I mean, it's just staggering, crazy. Have you heard that term about, do you use like 10% of your brain and all that kind of stuff, only 10% of your brain at a time? Sometimes, most days I feel like I'm only using that. I wish I could find a way to use more. But you use all your brain. I mean, there's blood supply going to your brain. You're using all different regions of your brain. You may be using one area more than another at any given time, but you're not just using only or tapping into only 10% of your brain. So. Okay, now we're going to go through the major components in the organization of the nervous system. And I assume you guys have, this course is done in a way that I assume you have no background in the nervous system. So hopefully, starting on that, we're all on an even playing field here so that you all should be able to learn this and understand it from starting as basic as we can get and working into more complex stuff, okay? And I think I put a copy of this in your handout today. So in the back of your handout should be this little schematic. I do some of these schematics just for my own help because I like to see the relationships between things. I like to see big picture. I can just get so easily lost in all the details of this stuff. So I was like, wait a sec, what's what part of what? What is a subcomponent of another thing? So sometimes I'll have this little sheet just laying next to me while I'm doing my reading or looking at things. So this just breaks down, basically, starting over on the left is the nervous system as a whole, and then further breaking it down into its smaller components to a certain level. It doesn't go all the way out to even, real different small components, but the major components and subcomponents of the nervous system. So, so when we're talking about, like if I say the brain, which is right here, so we have CNS, and it's breaking into the brain and the spinal cord. The brain, then you'll see, can be broken into 3 separate parts, and you can further break that down. Okay, so the brain itself is usually considered the cerebrum, which is that part we think of as the brain typically, the cerebellum, which sits below the cerebrum, and then even the brainstem is considered typically part of the brain. So, okay, just for your FYI. So the major basic components of the nervous system is starting with just the neurons, the cellular level individual neurons, and the neuroglial cells, okay, the neuroglial cells. That's the basic component. These make up your central nervous system, brain, brainstem, spinal cord, okay, central nervous system. And you have a peripheral nervous system, which you guys probably know more about the peripheral nervous system right now than I do. So, those lumbar plexus, brachial plexus, peripheral nerve going to your muscles, that's the nervous system. So you're warmed up and you're probably on that right now. And then we have an autonomic nervous system, which is kind of artificially divided out there in a way because the autonomic nervous system is something that controls that autonomic or automatic part of our, kind of homeostasis and so forth, automatic function of our bodies, but it has parts that are in the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Does that make sense? But your book, this is just how your book divides the basic components of the nervous system, so we'll go with it. I probably wouldn't put autonomic there, but your book does. So starting with the neurons, and we're going to start working through that list. Okay, so starting with the neurons. A neuron is the basic structural functional unit of the nervous system. A neuron that conveys information towards the central nervous system or towards another structure within the nervous system is considered or called an afferent neuron. So information is traveling in that neuron, bringing it towards the central nervous system or taking it towards another structure within the nervous system is called an afferent neuron. And I underline the A in there, afferent. I think of A as an acquire. You're acquiring something. You're gathering information. It's acquiring. So that's how I remember. Afferent is acquire, which is bringing information into a structure or into the central nervous system. An efferent neuron is one that's taking information away from a structure. So you're having an action potential or something being propagated away from the structure or from the central nervous system towards the peripheral nervous system. So an afferent neuron would be like your sensory neurons, okay? An efferent neuron is like your motor system, okay? Going out to your motor neurons going out to supply your muscles. So efferent, I think of the E as an exit. It's exiting. It's going away from the central nervous, or it's going away from another structure within the nervous system to another structure in the nervous system. That can still be efferent. Doesn't have to go to a muscle, okay? And same thing, you don't have to have a sensory receptor bringing in information. You can have an afferent neuron going from one structure, you know, in the central nervous system or in the brainstem up to the thalamus, and that can still be an afferent neuron going up into the thalamus, but not necessarily coming from a peripheral sensory structure. Does that make sense? So if it's going towards a structure, if action potential is being propagated along this neuron towards a structure, afferent. If it's going away from a structure, efferent. Okay. Neurons that connect only with other neurons are called interneurons. Okay. So if it's connecting just with another neuron and not some peripheral structure, that's an interneuron. Okay. So our sensory neurons that are coming from like a sensory receptor out in the periphery, not be an interneuron. Same thing with a motor neuron going out and ending at a muscle, or something ending at or something like that. Those are not interneurons. Interneurons are just connecting with other neurons. They don't connect with other structures. And that's what most of our nervous system is interneurons. That's how we have the complexity. All those quadrillions of synapses are because you have all these interneurons that when information is brought into the nervous system, that's how you make sense of it. That's how you kind of decode it and you manipulate that information and decide what to do with that. It's through that, those connections of interneurons. Neuroglial cells, that's the other cellular component, major classification of cellular parts of the nervous system. Glial means glue. It's literally the kind of the glue that holds the nervous system together. So they have these little end feet on them sometimes that help kind of stick it together and grab onto other neurons. They typically do not convey information. They provide more of a support service to the neurons. They help insulate it. They help nourish it. They help provide protection for it. They get rid of some of the waste products and metabolites in the nervous system. Those are the neuroglial cells. But what's interesting, though, because of the new ways of these functional MRIs and PET scans and looking at things, they're finding that they used to think neuroglial cells did not provide much as far as communication or processing, but now we're finding they do play a role in some of that. So they're not just this kind of neutral support cell. They actually do some, but they don't convey information through traditional action potentials. They just they convey information through these waves of changes in polarization that occur over networks of neurons. So they can influence larger networks of neurons, but they're still kind of figuring some of that out, exactly how these glial influence actual processing. Now we're going to focus on, so that was really simple, quick on neurons, in which we're going to get into a lot more detail on Friday. We'll get into the neuron itself and the axons and dendrites and action potentials and all that stuff will be Fridays, all 3 hours, just on the cells. Now the central nervous system, one of the other major components, CNS. CNS, your book talks about 7 main parts. Not all books are consistent with this, but we'll go by what yours says. 7 main parts. The cerebral hemispheres, which is what we typically think of as the brain, the wrinkly thing up here on the very top. The diencephalon, di is 2, right? Diencephalon, which is mainly they're talking about these structures called the thalamus and hypothalamus together. When you put those together, they're called the diencephalon, okay? The midbrain, which is part of your brainstem. The pons, also part of your brainstem. The cerebellum, which sits right behind the pons, the medulla, which is part of your brainstem, and then the spinal cord. Those are your 7 main components of the central nervous system. So here's your picture. Let me get my little drawing thing up here. So cerebral hemispheres, that's all this stuff here, okay? This is actually a cross-section where you've cut down through the middle of the cerebrum. We're actually looking at the medial surface of that cerebrum. So this is a right cerebral hemisphere. Over here, we're looking at the medial surface. We cut straight down through the middle of our brain. We're looking at that medial surface of it, okay? This structure here, together, this pink one, that's the diencephalon, okay, which is made up of your thalamus, which is this part of it right here, and then this region more down in this area here is your hypothalamus, okay? But that central area there, as a group, is called the diencephalon. thalamus and hypothalamus. And you have one on each side of your brain. You have two little egg-like thalami on each side, and then the hypothalamus just below it, in front of it. Okay. Then here is the brain. The brain stem is this whole structure here, which is divided into the midbrain. And it kind of makes sense. This looks like, when you look at where it sits, it's almost like right in the middle of the brain. You know, here's the brain all surrounding it, and there's that midbrain. That's part of your, it's way up in there, that midbrain. Okay. Then this next area here, the next thing below, this is the pons. So pons. And then just below that is the medulla. Sitting back off here is the cerebellum. And then once you cross through this opening here, the foramen magnum, that's your distinction of when you turn into the spinal cord. Okay? And then we have spinal cord below that. So those are your 7 main parts of the central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system. You guys know all about the peripheral nervous system. So this is all the parts of the nervous system that aren't encased in the skull or vertebral column, that aren't part of your central nervous system. So once nerves leave the central nervous system, they're peripheral nerves. Okay? You have cranial nerves, 12 pairs of cranial nerves that are considered peripheral neurons. Okay? And then 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Okay? Your spinal nerve roots and your spinal nerves that come out of the spinal column. Okay? That forms your peripheral nervous system. So don't, cranial nerves are kind of like spinal nerves. They just come off your brain stem or your brain instead of your spinal cord. Okay, so when we get to cranial nerve function, cranial nerves, you just kind of think of them kind of like spinal nerves, but they just come off your brain stem. And there is your olfactory bulbs, for smell. They're the only cranial nerve that comes directly out of your brain. That's the only peripheral nerve that comes directly straight out of your brain itself. It actually goes straight into your limbic system, which is part of your kind of emotional, provides emotional state and those kind of things. So, smell is considered kind of a primitive response, and it drives emotion, and smelling grandma's pie, that kind of stuff, and what the memories that brings up and those kind of things. So this picture, just everything in grayish blue is central nervous system, and everything in yellow is peripheral nervous system. Autonomic nervous system. If you remember autonomic nervous system from physiology, that you've got your sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Okay, sympathetic is that fight or flight system. It tends to ramp things up, ramp metabolism up, ramp activity up. It's also considered the thoracolumbar division of the autonomic nervous system, because the nerves that go out to drive the sympathetic system come out of the thoracolumbar area of your spinal cord. Okay, that's where they're coming out and using those spinal nerves and come out in those regions. Then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which they consider kind of the need and feed system, kind of more just basic metabolism, tends to slow some things down. We'll get into all that later. We'll get into this autonomic nervous system, have a whole session on that. But it's also considered the craniosacral division of the autonomic nervous system, because the nerves that go to drive parasympathetic activity are coming out of the cranial area through cranial nerves or the sacral area. Okay, so a few sacral nerves that go out to supply, especially, sexual function and excretory function and so forth. So that is why it's called the craniosacral division, is another way you call that parasympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. These innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, secretory glands, primarily play a role in homeostasis, just keeping basic homeostasis. They kind of antagonize each other, counteract each other. And so all I'm showing you here on your left, looking at this picture here. So this is all the sympathetic nerves that are all exiting from this thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord. Okay? And we'll detail how they exit and all that in a future lecture, okay, how all that works. This is the parasympathetic. They're coming through cranial nerves, primarily cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve, supplies a lot of parasympathetic activity in your system and your body. And then down here in the sacral area, so you've got the cranial and sacral parts of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is where those neurons arise from that are going to drive that function. All right, we'll take a break in another 7 or 8 minutes here. Let's start with language. Just like anatomy, that for musculoskeletal anatomy, neuroanatomy has its own kind of language. There's some overlap between some of that, but there's some new terms you'll probably hear. So let's just go through some of that. This really helps to, if you understand some of the basic language and things in terminology, you don't necessarily have to memorize everything. If you can read a term, and because the term is broken down a certain way or contains certain elements, you'll say, oh, that means it's going from here to here, or that's where this is located, the structure. So understanding that terminology can really help you so you don't freak out, like, I don't remember that. Oh, if I just break the word down or I put it together, then this is what it means. So terms to describe locations in the nervous system. This is very similar to what you've already learned in biomechanics and anatomy. So superior, a part is situated above another part, okay? Inferior, the part is below another part typically, okay? Have you guys heard the terms rostral and caudal? Is that a term you guys are familiar with at all? So the term rostral and caudal tends to be used more with what we call the neuraxis. You've learned to access through the body and the anatomical, anatomical access for the body, kind of like looking at a person in this position here. There's a neuraxis. There's an axis through the nervous system, and the nervous system, it goes straight up, but then it has a little we call cervical flexure, where the nervous system in the cerebrum, it takes a little bit of a kink to it. And I'll show you some pictures here that help make that understand that a little bit better. But rostral means towards the beak. Rostrum, nose, towards the beak, and caudal is the tail, so towards the tail. Okay, so rostral and caudal are terms we can use. And that's typically, like I say, in relationship, you typically use those terms in relationship to the neuraxis, the axis running through the nerves, the central nervous system's axis. There's anterior. You guys know what anterior means. Ventral means typically towards the front, okay? Doesn't necessarily mean it's always anterior. If you've got an animal that's like a reptile, and you'll see a picture of an alligator here, ventral might be down below. But on us, ventral's here, because we're standing up. But if we're on all fours, then ventral's down below. So if you understand kind of what we're talking about, you can make some assumptions, knowing if you know for what kind of an animal or what kind of a structure you're looking at. Posterior, towards the back. Dorsal is also towards the back, but that's, again, in relationship to the neuraxis. Dorsal back here, but if you're on all fours, dorsal is going to be up above you if you're talking about that. So if you hear the term ipsilateral, we typically refer to tracts or pathways in the nervous system. If they're ipsilateral, that means they began on one side of the nervous system, left or right, and they ended on that same side. So some tracts will actually cross over, but recross over. As long as they begin and end on the same side of the nervous system, you take the nervous system and split it into left and right. If it begins on one side and ends on the same side, it's an ipsilateral tract or pathway. If it begins on one side and ends on the opposite side, either going this way or coming back up this way, then it's a contralateral pathway, okay, or tract or pathway. So alligators are a lot more simple because their neuraxis is just straight like this. And they're on all fours. So when you look at dorsal, ventral, caudal, and posterior are synonymous here. Rostral and anterior are synonymous in an animal that's on all fours. We are different. So when we look at the neuraxis, our neuraxis, it goes straight up. It follows the body axis for the most part. But once you get to the cranium, it flexes. We call the cervical flexure. So when we talk about development of the nervous system, the brain starts to grow and it kind of tilts on top of the spinal cord and brainstem and kind of tilts over like this. So the neuraxis starts like this in utero, but then as we develop it, when the brain develops, it kind of flexes like that. So the neuraxis is a little bit got that flexure in it. Okay, so the thing you need to know when you're talking about, when I'm trying to tell you where something is in the nervous system, you have to ask yourself, first of all, where am I? If you are in the spinal cord or the brainstem, then it's the same as the body axis. The type, when I say if something's anterior or posterior, rostral or caudal, dorsal or ventral, it's very similar to what you've already learned. But once we get into the cerebrum, it flexes like this, and I'll show you this picture here. So let's look at spinal cord here. So spinal cord here if we're talking about structures in the spinal cord, so if I'm naming a structure or a certain level in the spinal cord, and I'm saying, you know, C7 is superior to T1, right? So if I say the C7 section is superior to T1, so that makes sense. It's superior, but I could also use the term that it's more rostral as well, because it's more rostral, although then this angles here, this neuraxis changes directions. But if we were to extend this neuraxis straight up like this, we could also call this rostral. So in the here's the midbrain, here's the brainstem, so midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal cord. All of those are running along the neuraxis, and we can just extend it straight up like this. So if I say something, I can either say something is superior or rostral, and those would be synonymous. I would most likely use superior. One structure is superior. Or like the pons is superior to the medulla. So the pons is or I could say the pons is rostral to the medulla. Those would be both acceptable terms if I'm in that part of the neuraxis, okay? Or I could say the, you know, the dorsal horns, or the part of the spinal cord is dorsal to another spot, okay? So dorsal, or I could say it's posterior, okay? So posterior and dorsal are synonymous in the spinal cord, brainstem, pons, midbrain, okay? And ventral and anterior are synonymous in that particular region. Does that make sense? Caudal or inferior are also synonymous in the neuraxis through this brainstem and spinal cord. But then when we get up to the cerebrum, the neuraxis is more horizontal. So in the cerebrum, if I say, you know, the parietal lobe up here it's dorsal or superior to the temporal lobe. I can say dorsal or superior. So that was different than what I just was talking about before with the spinal cord and brainstem. Superior and rostral were synonymous, but now dorsal and superior are synonymous. I'm making it harder than it needs to be, but I don't want you to get confused, because when I'm making up test questions, or I'm trying to talk about, or you're reading anything about the nervous system and they're talking about where structures are in relationship to each other, that can really get confusing because of this really simple kind of concept. Is just ask yourself, where am I at? If I'm in the cerebrum and they're talking about cerebral structures, I need to know that dorsal and superior are synonymous, rostral and anterior synonymous, and caudal and posterior synonymous in the cerebrum, okay? And ventral and inferior are synonymous in the cerebrum. And then, but when we get into the other axis there, the one through the spinal cord and the brainstem, we need to know the pairs of terms that are synonymous. I will tend to use superior, anterior, posterior more than I will rostral, caudal, dorsal, ventral. However, many books use those terms, and so you need to be able to read more than one resource. And I occasionally might use those terms. Anyway, after you've kind of gone through that yourself, and if you're still struggling, come sit with me and we can try to make sure you feel good about that concept. All right, break time. Ready for a break? So let's come back in. Any questions before we go on break? It's all perfectly clear, or you're just way too tired? Brain hasn't started yet. All right, come back at 10 after. So we talked about, you know, where parts are in relationship to each other, dorsal, ventral, superior, all that good stuff. Now we're talking about these neuroanatomical planes through the nervous system, or cuts through the nervous system, kind of like very similar to cuts through the body. So that works out well. That pretty much the same planes for the nervous system work pretty well for you know, the same as the body. We have the coronal plane, the frontal plane, so it's this one here. sagittal plane. So right down, kind of cutting down through this way, and the horizontal or transverse plane going this way. Come on, why won't my, there we go. Coronal is this, oops, this thing acts up on me sometimes here. Let's see if this works. So coronal is kind of this plane I'm kind of sketching on right there. So that's this frontal plane, coronal plane. And then we have our horizontal, it would be this one here. And then we have our sagittal, which is right here. And this would be this one cut right down through this called the superior and longitudinal fissure here, right down between the two hemispheres. That would be called a mid-sagittal cut. So, you know, then if you started making little cuts away from that, that would be parasagittal. Okay, so parasagittal cuts would be anything off of that. So when we start getting into slices of the brain, we'll see these mid-sagittal versus parasagittal cuts. We have kind of a mid-horizontal cuts and then kind of para-horizontal or horizontal cuts that go above and below that. So we'll see, and same with coronal. Some of the cuts, when you look through your neuroanatomy, this guy, right here, so this thing, if you look at, say, for example, let's see if it shows here. When we get into some of the cuts, like, say, this cut right here, this is a frontal or coronal section here. So it's like this one right here, coronal or frontal cut here. If you look on the back side of that, you'll actually see this is the key to these structures, but on the back it shows you where that cut, there's a little line there, it shows you exactly where that cut was made for that. And then this shows you an MRI image too of what that section or that coronal section looks like on an MRI image. Okay. And sometimes you'll notice so that this cut right here, this coronal cut, it's not completely straight up and down. It's slightly oblique a little bit. So you'll notice that some of these, they do some slight obliqueness to these cuts to get through some certain structures. So like the next one here, so you see this is this cut here. This is kind of a horizontal cut through the brain, but it's definitely got some obliquity to it in that horizontal cut. They're trying to, it's kind of right along the neuroaxis is where they're making that cut. So, all right. So these are some of the major cuts through the nervous system right here. Horizontal section, this would be a mid-horizontal section right there. It's kind of your classic mid-horizontal cut. You see a couple ventricles here. This is the lateral ventricles. This is the front of the lateral ventricles, and this is the back of them, the tail of the lateral ventricles. Then here is your classic kind of mid-coronal section here, right down through the middle of the brain. Here we see the lateral ventricles again. This is a mid-sagittal section. So this is a sagittal section, but right down through the middle of the brain between the two cerebral hemispheres. That's a mid-sagittal section. This is of the brainstem, okay? This is actually down in the medulla. This is a horizontal section through the medulla, okay? And we're going to go through mainly horizontal. Once we get into the brainstem and the spinal cord, we're really just looking at horizontal sections. The cerebrum will look at horizontal, coronal, and sagittal sections, okay? We really only do a mid-sagittal section right here, this one for the cerebrum. We really don't do parasagittal sections in this course. We do a few, we do mainly just a mid-coronal section, but we do look at a few slices of horizontally through the cerebrum at different levels, and just 3 or 4 levels. So. Still on neuroterminology here. There's certain terms that are commonly used when we're describing the nervous system that refer to pathways in the nervous system or groups of nerve fibers, which are talking mainly the axons. Okay, so the neurons typically have an axon coming off of them, and so groups of these axons or nerve fibers, okay, are called, these are all different terms that are used to describe pathways or nerve fibers or groups of axons. Capsule, if you hear the term capsule, that is often referring to a group of nerve fibers. We have a big area in our cerebrum called the internal capsule. And the internal capsule is a bunch of white matter axon fibers running from our cerebral cortex down through our brain that are going to eventually go down to become either motor system, and sometimes sensory system comes up through the internal capsule. So there's a bunch of axons, nerve fibers, white matter called the internal capsule that carries a lot of information on it, okay, both to and from the cerebrum. Radiations, those are also groups of nerves. We'll talk about the optic radiation is the main one we'll talk about. So there's an area goes from a part of our lateral geniculate nucleus back to our occipital lobe called the optic radiations that carry information from our brainstem area in our brain back to the occipital lobe, the optic radiations. But the radiation is just a group of the nerve fibers, axons. Lemniscus, if you hear the term lemniscus, lemniscus means ribbon-like. And we'll talk about a pathway in the brainstem called the medial lemniscus. That carries proprioception, touch, and conscious proprioception in the brainstem. That pathway running through the brainstem is called the medial lemniscus or medial lemniscal system. A tract, if you hear like the spinal thalamic tract, that's just a group of nerves running in the central nervous system somewhere. So we'll talk about some different tracts. If you hear the term fasciculus, fasciculus means little bundle or packet. So if you hear the term fasciculus tacked on to anything, like we'll talk about the fasciculus gracilis, the fasciculus cuneatus, those are pathways that are running through the brainstem, okay, that are carrying some proprioceptive information as well. So don't have to memorize those right now. I'm just giving you examples, okay? There's also things called funiculi or funiculus, okay? It's larger than a fasciculus. You might have a couple fasciculi running within a funiculi. And we're going to talk about the spinal cord, like the whole back part of the spinal cords, where there's information running up the back of the spinal cord and both sides of the spinal cord called the dorsal columns, but together they make up the dorsal funiculus. The dorsal funiculus of the spinal cord is just both dorsal columns together. It's just called a funiculus, just larger than a fasciculus. Nerve. If you hear the term nerve, a nerve is typically talking about, we're usually referring to a peripheral nerve of some type when we talk about a nerve. It's coming out of the central nervous system or going towards the central nervous system, and there's axons in there. It's a group of axons, often sensory, motor, and autonomic, running in that nerve. But that's the axons that are running through that nerve. There's not cell bodies in there. There's cell bodies at one side or the other, but the nerve itself is just a group of axons. And then a commissure. So when we talk about commissural fibers, typically a commissure fiber are axons that are sharing information from one side of your brain to the other. Okay, commissural fibers. We're talking about the anterior white commissure. Okay, posterior commissure. Those are commissural. One side, they typically go from one side of the cerebrum to the other, so you can get communication between your left and right hemispheres, but they're just axons. Okay, that's the commissural fibers, the axons. So if you hear those terms, radiation capsule, lemniscus, tract, you're saying, oh, that's some pathway or tract or group of nerves and axons. Okay. If we're talking about actual cell bodies, okay, so the cell body, okay, or a group of cell bodies, these are the terms you're going to hear. So like a ganglia, okay, we'll talk about the dorsal root ganglia, which is where the cell body for your sensory neuron sits, just outside your spinal cord is the dorsal root ganglia. So that's the cell body for a sensory neuron. Or we'll talk about the basal ganglia, which are a group of cell bodies in your middle of your cerebrum that are important for, we're going to talk about more for the motor aspect and the control over motor function, but the basal ganglia. If you hear the term a lamina is like, you laminate something and you have these layers. Well, lamina are typically layers of cell bodies that have different histological features. So when we look at the center part of the spinal cord is where the cell bodies are. In the spinal cord, the cell bodies are in the middle. The pathways are on the outside. But in the middle, they actually have different, they call lamina. You divide them into these lamina. There's 10 different lamina called Rex's lamina. And they just have, each of those cells has different histological features that you can associate with a different function. Whether it be a motor cell, whether it be a sensory processing cell in the spinal cord. So that's when we talk about lamina. If you hear the term body, that's also another term to use for like the geniculate nucleus or geniculate body, they'll call it. Okay, that's another group of cell bodies. Typically a body is a group of nuclei or cell bodies. Or if you hear the term nucleus, well, we're going to talk about a thing called the nucleus gracilis. Okay, it's a group of cell bodies that's part of the processing. It's one of the stopovers for processing proprioceptive information called the nucleus gracilis. So if you hear those terms, we're just talking about groups of cell bodies in the nervous system somewhere. Now let's talk about looking more at the just kind of outside of looking at the external features of the nervous system. If you have a furrow or a depression, so the dents or wrinkles in your nervous system on the outside of your brain, cerebellum, spinal cord, these are terms you'll use to describe these bumps, or not bumps, but furrows and depressions, okay? Or sulci, okay? So the term sulci is one that means literally rut or furrow, a sulci. A fissure, it's a larger, deeper than a sulci. So we'll talk about the lateral fissure, okay? There's right between your temporal lobe and your parietal lobe and frontal lobes, there's this big lateral fissure, we call it. But it's deeper and bigger than most of the other depressions in the central nervous system on the outside of it. Or a fossa. Okay, we'll talk about a thing called the rhomboid fossa, which is in the back part of the brainstem. There's a depression in the back part of the brainstem called the rhomboid fossa. When you take off the cerebellum off the back of the brainstem, and you look at the back of the brainstem, there's a little depression there called the rhomboid fossa. It kind of looks like a rhomboid-shaped thing when you pull the cerebellum off. So rhomboid fossa, just like you have a fossa in your bones. Okay, so some of that terminology carries over to the musculoskeletal system as well. So does some of the terminology when we talk about bumps and ridges. So bumps or ridges are prominent features that stick out on a nervous system. So things like a peduncle. A peduncle is a connecting part. We'll talk about the cerebral peduncles. Part of your midbrain has these things called cerebral peduncles that join your cerebrum to your brainstem. That's a connecting stalk or part. There's a gyrus. We'll talk about all the gyri. It's called circle. And then a lot of them are kind of look circular or rounded in nature, so that's why they're called gyri. A brachium. Okay, we have like a brachium of the inferior colliculus. So there's like an area on the surface of the brainstem where you have neurons running from one area to another, but that feature on the surface that you see, this little area, is called a brachium. Okay, so you call it the brachium of the inferior colliculus, which is a relay area for hearing from one area to another. Okay, so don't worry about that now. I'm just giving you examples. And then tubercles. Okay, there's little tubercles that are bumps on the nervous system. Okay, so we'll talk about the gracile tubercle and the cuneate tubercles, which are on the back side of the brainstem. It's a nodule or small eminence. These are smaller eminence. Then we talk about layers in the nervous system. So lamina is another. We've already heard the term lamina. Those are layers in the nervous system, or layers typically of different cell types. And lamina means thin sheet or veneer. The cortex, so in the cerebrum, our cortex is that little couple millimeter thick layer where most of our cell bodies are on the outside. That means bark, okay? It's like the bark of a tree. It's the bark of your brain, the cortex. A tectum, we'll talk about an area in the brainstem called the tectum of the midbrain. It's the roof of the midbrain. It's called the tectum of the midbrain. Or a tegmentum is also called a covering. We'll talk about the tegmentum of the midbrain, and actually the tegmentum of the brainstem as kind of the covering of the brainstem. It's not an outside covering. It's just where parts are related to other parts, and we'll show you that. Any questions on terminology? I'll try to reinforce that as we go through here. So now we're going to go through and start going through anatomy, just basic neuroanatomy stuff. Again, you're going to hear all this again 2 or 3 more times. I want you to just try to get a sense for the big picture right now, start getting familiar with terminology, and I will tell you exactly what's on the quiz tomorrow that you have to know for tomorrow from this neuroanatomy stuff, okay? So I'll narrow it down a little bit for you, because there's a lot. We're going over a ton today. I don't expect you to have it all down by tomorrow, okay? So we're going to go through and talk about different major parts of the nervous system, starting with the cerebrum. and specifically the cerebral hemispheres, these two big hemispheres, okay? That does not include the cerebellum or brainstem. This is the cerebral hemispheres. That's the wrinkly two halves of your brain right up here, okay? Big picture. What do they do in general? They process motor, memory, sensory, reasoning, language, intelligence, personality, and emotion. So a lot of the higher order, purposeful kind of functioning, making sense of the world, interacting with the world, that's cerebral function, you know, and doing that in a purposeful, conscious way, okay? We do a lot of other interaction with the world and processing information more unconscious levels, more down the brainstem area, okay, and the spinal cord. You know, we have amazing ability to coordinate movement and process sensor information that we never are consciously aware of. The cerebral hemisphere is more related to the conscious awareness. We have four primary lobes. Some people add a fifth, but we have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Some books will talk about a limbic or insular lobe, which is actually, you can't see directly from the surface of the cerebrum. You actually have to get in, and the lateral fissure, you have to get in there and pull it. When tomorrow, when you look at the brains, we actually have real specimens here tomorrow, you can kind of pull the lateral fissure apart and look down. There's some more brain tissue down below called insular lobe, or sometimes called the limbic lobe. So, but right now, know these four, okay? We have a lateral sylvian fissure, so now we're talking about major features of the lateral outside surface of the cerebrum, and I'll show you pictures here in a second. That's the lateral or sylvian fissure. Those are interchangeable, lateral fissure or sylvian fissure, okay? Some people will call it the lateral sylvian fissure. There's an entire book, I wish I should have brought it in. There's a book about this thick called Alternate Terms of the Nervous System. So for almost every term in the nervous system, there's 3 or 4 alternate terms for it. And so I'll try to be consistent with your book and the terminology we use, but just realize that if you're in England, they use terminology that's much different than ours, and or by certain convention. When a book was written, that, you know, that terminology changes over time. We have longitudinal fissure. This thing right down the center, this big longitudinal fissure, this superior longitudinal fissure running right down the middle of our brain that separates the two cerebral hemispheres. And if you pull that apart, you'll look right down, you'll see this really shiny white structure. That's a commissural fibers. They're white matter fibers that make up the corpus callosum. You'll see that in a minute when we show you some pictures here. So when you pull the brain apart, you'll see the corpus callosum down in there. So that's what's next, the corpus callosum. That's the communication between the two hemispheres. Remember we talked about fibers that connect one side of the brain to the other, our commissural fibers. The corpus callosum is a large collection of commissural fibers that connect your left and right parts of your brain. Frontal lobes, mainly frontal lobes, parietal lobe, are the two main areas it connects. There's an anterior commissure that connects your two temporal lobes. There's a posterior commissure that connects more of your two occipital lobes. The corpus callosum is connecting mainly your frontal and parietal lobes, left and right sides. Our surface of our cerebrum is gray matter, or the cortex. It's microscopic in nature. You can kind of see it, and when you cut through it, you can see like a little millimeter or two thick, difference between the white matter and the gray matter. White matter is deep to the cortex. That's where the axons are. That's where the cell bodies are up in that cortex, and then their axons project down, or sometimes axons are projecting up to those cells on the cortex. Okay. So in the cerebrum, the cell bodies are on the outside, and the white matter, the axons, are in the inside. In the spinal cord, the cell bodies are more on the inside, in the center, and then the white matter is on the outside, so it's reversed. We also have, as part of the cerebral hemispheres, are these big structures called the basal ganglia, okay, which is your caudate, globus pallidus, and putamen together make up this group of nuclei called the basal ganglia. And actually, there's a push to change that to, instead of calling them basal ganglia, Typically, if you say the term ganglia, it's referring to cell bodies of the nervous system located in the peripheral nervous system, like the dorsal root ganglia is part of the peripheral nervous system. You shouldn't use the term ganglia with the central nervous system. The basal ganglia are part, but people have been using it for so long. But probably a better term is basal nuclei. It's the basal nuclei, or cerebral nuclei is another term commonly used. But we'll call it, your book calls it basal ganglia. We'll stay with basal ganglia. But typically, a ganglia is associated with a group of neurons in the peripheral nervous system of cell bodies. Don't worry about the subcomponents yet, but we're still in the cerebrum, okay? The other main structure that's sitting in the cerebrum is the diencephalon, okay, which is primarily the diencephalon, di is 2, is thalamus and hypothalamus is really what we're talking about. But in reality, anything with an alamus on it is also kind of part of this diencephalon, or is part of the thalamic structure matrix. So there's a thing called the epithalamus and the subthalamus. But right now, for our purposes, think of the diencephalon as a thalamus and hypothalamus together as a group. Okay. The diencephalon, or the thalamus, is really this kind of major relay center. The thalamus proper is this egg-shaped structure that's for relaying. It's kind of like the administrative assistant, secretary, well, I don't know the politically correct term to use, but it's the kind of the gatekeeper or the initial place that when information like sensory information comes up and is going to go to your cortex, it has to stop at the thalamus first. And then the thalamus decides what gets up to the cortex for conscious awareness and so forth. Also, when you're sending a signal from one structure down to another structure, sometimes it'll stop at the thalamus first. It's like a processing relay structure. So it modulates overall activity of things flowing in and out of the central nervous system, this thalamus structure. Okay. Versus the hypothalamus, it's particularly focused on autonomic function, and more specifically, eating, reproduction, and homeostasis. It's the master governor of your autonomic system, and homeostasis is the hypothalamus. So it's not a relay structure. It's a structure that's associated with homeostasis, autonomic function. Okay. We do have this thing called the epithalamus. The epithalamus sits back behind the thalamus. I'll show you in a second here. It's also known as the pineal gland. If you hear the pineal gland, the epithalamus are the same thing. It helps to regulate pituitary function and adrenal function. We also have a region called the subthalamus. The subthalamus sits below even the hypothalamus. So you have a hypothalamus and the subthalamus sits below that. It's actually involved with movement. It actually has very strong connections with your basal ganglia structures. It's more tied into the basal ganglia than it is to these other thalamic structures. So, okay. Don't get overwhelmed with the details right now. Diencephalon, thalamus, hypothalamus. A couple other ones that have an alamus at the end. We'll get to more detail on those later. So this is just trying to give you some little perspective on where these things sit. You have your two big gray cerebral hemispheres. Everything in yellow is basal ganglia structures. And then the things in blue right here, that's your thalamus. We don't have hypothalamus on here, or subthalamus or anything like that, or epithalamus. Just you have basal ganglia, everything's paired, right? You have one on the left and one on the right. So you have some basal ganglia nuclei on the left, some basal ganglia nuclei on the right. That's all the yellow stuff here. Okay, those yellow structures. This one's the left, and then over here is the right one on the other side. Same thing with the thalamus. This blue structure sitting deep to that. They're in there. There's one on each side, a left and a right thalamus. There's a hypothalamus in there too, some pineal glands, hypothalamus, subthalamus on both sides, okay? To help you guys with that, so hopefully it's working now because we needed to get the connection working. For the virtual reality stuff, that's a good way to go in, and I will take you all in there as a class during one of our breaks or at the end or beginning of a class here in the next day or two. We'll go in there, and I'll just make sure you guys all know how to turn on the virtual reality. I've got a little sheet that tells you what to do. But I would go in. That's be a good way to how the heck does all this stuff fit into the brain? Where are those ventricles? Where are these thalamus. Where's this basal ganglia structures? If you go in there and like actually step into the brain and pull apart the structures, then you can see how it all actually fits in there. So when you start seeing cross sections, if you kind of have a better three-dimensional perspective of where these things sit, as long as you know where that cross section is, you can kind of put the picture together and help you to identify stuff or structures that you make. I'm not sure what that is. Oh yeah, now that I've done that three-dimensional kind of moving that brain around, if there's a cross section there, I'm going to be hitting this structure, this structure, this structure. It helped me doing that virtual reality a little bit that you just can't get from a flat picture like this. So here's that cerebrum. This is a mid-sagittal cut, right? So there's the cerebrum. This is the corpus callosum. This is this area right here. This is the diencephalon, which is made up of our thalamus, which is thalamus, and this is the hypothalamus right in there, okay? So those are the main things we're looking at this picture that are parts of the cerebrum, that are all parts of the cerebrum. We can't see the basal ganglia here. The basal ganglia is actually, deeper in there. We cannot see. This is just a mid-sagittal cut. We're just seeing those structures are in that mid-sagittal cut. The basal ganglia actually sit in here, kind of in this region here, but deeper in. You got to keep going farther laterally there. Deeper in is the basal ganglia sitting in the kind of meat of the cerebrum in there. Okay. Looking at the outside of the cerebral hemispheres, here's the lobes, okay? So blue here is frontal lobe. And it's just good to know, what does that frontal lobe do in super general terms? Know the basics first before you start getting into the... It's motor system and personality, okay? So motor and what makes you you, as far as personality goes. Decision making, conscious decision making, personality, motor system, okay? Temporal lobe, this area in lighter orange right here. This is the temporal lobe. Primary things, memory and initial auditory processing. Information that comes in through your ears and you process auditorily goes into that temporal lobe area. Makes sense. It's kind of near your ear area down here. But your hippocampus, there's a structure deep down in here. The hippocampus, that's the area for memory that's so important. Hippocampal structures. Parietal, this green area right here, primarily for somatosensory processing. So when you have a sensory signal comes up that you're consciously aware of, oops, somebody poked me here, I feel that there, it's going to, particularly that region right there, in your parietal lobe, okay? The rest of the parietal lobe, most of the rest of this area here in the parietal lobe is called association, is like association areas. You'll notice the parietal lobe is nicely positioned between the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. It has borders with 3 other lobes. So it actually is very involved with integrating and processing information from the various lobes to make sense of the world for us, usually from more of a sensory experience, okay? Our left and right sides do a little bit different, depending on, the right side tends to construct more like three-dimensional space and where you're at in the world and where your body is in the world and so forth. Left side's a little different. Both sides do some of that, but there's a little variation. But the parietal lobe is somatosensory and association between different visual, auditory, and even motor. So your motor system, as you're moving, you're getting proprioceptive input coming back and telling about the results of your actions as you're moving. And do I need to make an error or correction, from the last movement I just did? Parietal lobe helps with that. We have the occipital lobe back here in red. That's going to be primarily visual processing. It's a big area. A lot of your brain is devoted to vision, that one area. Vision is a very primary, sensory thing that we really heavily rely on as humans, and a lot of animals do too, because it's fast. It's easy to trick, though, the visual system, but it's very fast and it helps guide our movements. But lots of processing has to occur there. And then the insular lobe is the one I was telling you about, the insular or limbic lobe. That's the one where if you take that, lateral sylvian fissure, which is this guy right here, lateral sylvian fissure, and you take some tongs or your fingers and you gently pull it apart, you'll see some more gyri and sulci down here deep inside there, and that's considered the limbic lobe or the insula. It tends to plays a role more autonomic function and visceral sensation of your viscera and regulation of autonomic function is what they think anyway. So I'm going to go through major features of the outside or lateral surface of the cerebrum here. We're going to go quick because we're going to do it again tomorrow with real brains sitting in front of you. So I'm going to have these same images up. You guys are going to get in small groups tomorrow. I'm going to have 7 brains here and groups of 5. You're going to have them at your desk there. You're going to gather around. I'm going to take you through the same thing. You're going to find them on a real specimen while I highlight them here. But I'm just going to highlight them real quick here just to get you start knowing where things are at so you can study on your own. So first is the cerebral longitudinal fissure, which we can't see here. That's the thing right here in the middle. So you have to have 2 hemispheres to actually have a cerebral longitudinal fissure. If you only got one, we're only looking at a left hemisphere here. You need a right hemisphere, and you got to see that fissure down the middle. That's the cerebral longitudinal fissure. But we can see, this is always the first thing you want to find, is the lateral sylvian fissure. If you can't find the lateral sylvian fissure, nope, don't go further than that. So you got to find this guy here. That's a good orienting structure to get you started. So that's a lateral sylvian fissure. Then we're going to find the next major feature to find is called the central sulcus. In this brain, every brain's a little different, but most brains have some, features that look very similar. This would be the central sulcus on this brain. The way I know if it's a central sulcus, there are brains where it's like, oh, is that the central sulcus here? Is this the central sulcus here? I typically have to follow that sulcus, follow the sulcus all the way up over the top ridge of the cerebrum, and look where it goes on just a little bit into the medial surface. Usually the central sulcus will extend just over the top of the ridge and just a little bit down on the medial surface, and usually it will go a little bit backwards. And so let me show you. So here it is right here. It's coming up over here and extends backwards a little bit like this. So if on the other side, that central sulcus would be coming down like that. Okay. So that's usually I kind of trace it over with my finger and see if it goes actually to the other side and just angles backwards a little bit when it goes over the medial surface there. So that's the central sulcus. Once you identify that, now we're going to, once you get the central sulcus, you're going to move one sulcus forward, okay, which is going to be called the pre-central sulcus. Makes sense? You're in front or before, pre. So in this case, it's this sulcus right here. Now this is where, again, variations in brain. It could actually be this one here. And then most of the time the central sulcus extends, but this guy, on this brain it doesn't. You kind of have to jump over that. But I would say it's kind of more just this, this general region right here is the pre-central sulcus. Okay. And now what we've done, let's just keep finding structures, then we'll talk function here in a second. Then we go one sulcus back from, here's the central sulcus, and go one sulcus back. Again, this is kind of a weird sulcus on this brain. It's this right here. Most of the time it's a little straighter up and down, and this is actually showing a pretty big area here. Most of the time it's usually a little smaller area that this defines between the central sulcus, but this brain, every brain's a little different. So I would say this would be more the post-central sulcus, and we had to jump a gyri here a little bit just to kind of connect the dots. Sometimes you got to do that, jump a little gyrus to connect the dots. Most of your brains will actually probably have better sulci than this brain does. So that's the post-central sulcus. Then there's a little thing called the preoccipital notch, and it's right here. Remember we said there's notches. Sometimes there's notches or fosses, but this is the preoccipital notch right here. So here's the cerebellum, sits right here. you kind of come like 2/3 of the way back, on the cerebellum here, and there's this little just indentation or notch called the preoccipital notch. And that's going to help define where the occipital lobe starts, is that preoccipital notch. It's subtle, okay, but it's just above the cerebellum, about 2/3 of the way back on the cerebellum. Preoccipital notch. So now let's define some gyri. So those were mainly we're talking about indentations or sulci, but so the gyrus that we're going to define here, once we define these two sulci here, so central sulci and precentral sulcus, this is going to define the precentral gyrus. The gyrus right in front of the central sulcus, precentral gyrus. Then just back behind that is the postcentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus, this is your primary motor strip. That is where your cell bodies for the big motor neurons that go down to your spinal cord to tell your anterior horn cells to send a signal to tell the muscle to contract. Okay, that's the motor area of the brain, the conscious, voluntary motor area of the brain. Okay, brainstem does a lot of motor control. Spinal cord does a lot of motor stuff, but this is the, hey, I want to move my finger like this, and I want to touch that, or I want to grab that. That's originating from this area here. Okay. The postcentral gyrus, this area just behind, that's your primary sensory area. So different modalities of sensation, pain, temperature, proprioception that you're consciously aware of. That you can say, somebody touched me right here, or right there. It's because that signal is going to a very specific location, somatotopically arranged on that part of your brain to give you a location identification. Because it registered on this certain spot in my cerebrum, that means it came from this spot on my arm or that spot on my leg. And it's the conscious awareness of sensation, okay, that goes to that region of the brain. And then lastly, the only other gyrus we'll show here just for now is just the superior temporal gyrus, which is this area right there. So superior temporal gyrus. Okay, that's a primary auditory cortex. And actually the primary auditory region is really kind of right in this area here is where primary auditory information comes in for the initial processing. Once it comes in from your cochlear nerve and gets into the brainstem, it's relayed to that part of your cerebrum for initial conscious, interpretation, okay, or categorization. Did somebody ring a bell? Is that a language? Do I need to interpret? That kind of stuff. So that's where it goes, is right there. The brain is pretty easy sometimes. Like there's a sulci right here, and you kind of extend it back here, and then that divides you into a superior, middle, and inferior. So this is inferior, middle, and superior temporal gyri. So, and it kind of does the same thing up here in the cerebrum, where you kind of have, superior, middle, but we don't worry about that right now. Okay, it's not rocket science. We'll get into those details later on. And now, question.
On the handout, we have a parieto-occipital sulcus.
So that,
just between the two lobes.
yeah, and actually let me show you this here. So here's the lateral sylvian fissure. Here's the preoccipital notch. The parieto-occipital sulcus is actually right here. This is looking at the medial surface of the cerebrum. But if you extend it over the edge to that lateral surface, which it's right here, and then you extend the line from here to here, that's how you define your occipital lobe from the lateral surface. Okay, so that's how we define the occipital lobe. Then if we just take this lateral sylvian fissure and extend it all the way over to that line, and then we take our central sulcus and extend it down, now that's how we divide our brain into its four primary lobes is how we do that, okay? So that was lateral surface. Now we're on medial surface. And so to tomorrow's quiz, you're going to see either a lateral surface of a cerebrum or a medial surface. It'll be one of these two, but it'll be a more simplistic diagram. It won't be an actual photo. It'll be a line drawing that is pretty easy to look at, and it'll be just kind of focusing on some of the major structures of just this or this. If you know these structures that I'm pointing out on medial or lateral surface for tomorrow's quiz, you'll do just great. Okay, so let's go on the medial surface here and show. This is medial surface, always a little more scary, but it's a little more interesting. There's actually some cool stuff in here. So let's look at the thing that kind of sticks right out at us, this thing called the corpus callosum. That is this structure right here. That's the corpus callosum. That's that commissural fiber, white matter. Those are axons running from one hemisphere to the other that primarily join this parietal lobe and frontal lobes. That's communication between the lobes on frontal and parietal lobes, left and right, through that corpus callosum. Okay. And the corpus callosum can be subdivided. You don't have to know this for tomorrow's quiz, but I'm just introducing you to it right now into different areas. The first is the rostrum, or the beak, the front part. And it's actually this little tip right here at the end. It's kind of like a beak sitting out there. You know, that rostrum, it goes out and it curls back under just a little bit, but it's the most rostral part in a sense. If it didn't curl under, it'd be sticking out straight there a little farther, but it's the rostrum of the corpus callosum. The next part is the genu. You guys remember the genu, like genu valgum? It's the bend. Genu is a bend, or the knee, or kind of like, so this area right in here, that's the genu, that curved bend. Then the major area right here in the middle, that's going to be your trunk, the trunk of the corpus callosum. And then the little rounded part back here is the splenium of the corpus callosum. So it can be broken into 4 separate smaller components. But for tomorrow, if you just see a line going to this guy here, corpus callosum. But later on, when you get to the neuroanatomy exam where you're looking at these pictures, I might just have to identify just that spot, be specific. If I'm saying be specific, I'm asking you to identify that smaller subdivision or localized location. All right, diencephalon. This is what it looks like in the real thing. I've just seen the drawing so far, but this is the thalamus right here that I just outlined, that egg-like. We're looking at the medial surface of the thalamus here. It's like a little egg, and it extends farther and deeper into the cerebral cortex. We're looking at just at one little surface edge of that egg that's sitting in there, okay? We're looking at the medial surface of that egg. Right here, this region below, that's the hypothalamus. And the two of those together as a unit are called the diencephalon. So thalamus relay structure. Motor and sensory information, and the basal ganglia uses the thalamus to relay information to and from each other up to the cortex. It's the secretary of the brain. Hypothalamus, it has to do with homeostasis and autonomic function. Okay. There's a bump right here. It's not functionally important. Most brains have it, some brains don't. It also depends on how good of a cut I get through this mid-sagittal section. That's called the interthalamic adhesion. Not every brain, not every person has an interthalamic adhesion. Most people do. About 80–90% of people have an interthalamic adhesion. That's a little connecting stalk between the two thalami. The two thalami are sitting really close to each other. There's a little space between the two thalami, which is called your third ventricle. There's a little space of cerebrospinal fluid in there. And there's this little tiny connecting stalk going between those two thalami right there in the center of your brain. But it's this little tiny sliver of a space that's called the third ventricle. It's between your two thalami, the two medial surfaces of your thalami right there. They're right next to each other. So tomorrow, some of the brains may have a interthalamic adhesion, but everybody always asks, what's this bump here? It's just the interthalamic adhesion. I don't even know that it's that functionally relevant or exactly what it does. Obviously, maybe some communication between the thalami, but people that don't have it seem to be normal, so I don't know how important it really is. Anterior commissure. So this is right here. This is where things get a little confusing. There's a little bit of a white structure here. It's a rounded in nature right there called the anterior commissure. Sometimes it's called the anterior white commissure or the AWC. So if you hear anterior commissure or anterior white commissure, that's a commissural fiber that actually has connections. It goes, here's the temporal lobe. You can see the medial surface of this temporal lobe. And then it goes over to the other temporal lobe if it was sitting over here. So there's connecting fibers that are going from temporal lobe to temporal lobe through this anterior white commissure. And I'll erase this all again so you can just kind of take a gander at it here. So it's this white structure right there. Okay. People always ask this. So here's the corpus callosum. This little structure right here that looks like a little tiny corpus callosum, you see that? That's called the fornix, which is down here. It's part of the limbic system. But the anterior white commissure sits right here at the tip of the fornix. However, tomorrow when you look at your specimens, oftentimes the fornix gets ripped off or destroyed. So when you look at your specimens tomorrow, here's the fornix. That may be gone. There's a little membrane here. There's a membrane that you can see right here. On a lot of your brains tomorrow, this membrane is gone, and what you're doing is you're looking right into one of the lateral ventricles. Or you see a big space in the brain, a lateral ventricle. That membrane is called the septum pellucidum, but when you cut through the brain, you may lose it. Or people purposely tear it off so you can look into the lateral ventricle. But you usually lose the fornix at that point too. So when we start looking at your brains tomorrow, I'll come around and make sure you confirm which is the anterior white commissure. And a lot of times people end up poking their little probe into the anterior white commissure so many times it kind of destroys it. It just kind of turns into mush. Parietal occipital sulcus. This is kind of like easy to find. It's this big sulcus right here between the occipital lobe and the parietal lobe here. Okay, so the parietal occipital sulcus. That's kind of like, it should be as easy to find as the lateral sylvian fissure on the outside of the cerebral hemispheres on the medial surface, the lateral sylvian, or the parietal occipital sulcus. Staying in the, let's get through this and then we'll take another break. The next one is the calcarine sulcus. So here's our parietal occipital sulcus. This is the calcarine sulcus right here. It's got this little bump in it. I'm trying to remember, calcarine is like, it was named after, it's kind of hook-like. It's kind of like a hook-like, and I'm trying to remember the origin of calcarine, but it has to do with like the rooster has a hook on its leg, you know, like the rooster has those pointed little hooks. That's kind of what was named after, is this calcarine look to it, this little hook to it. So that's the calcarine sulcus. That divides two different, or defines the borders of several gyruses in the occipital lobe. The lingual gyrus, which is this area right here, and lingual means tongue-like, and it looks kind of like a tongue, you know, that sticking your tongue out, right? I guess you got to imagine it. But, and then the other part, this part region right up here above that calcarine sulcus, this whole area here is called the cuneus. Okay? I pointed out because basically your primary visual area where that vision is first processed when it gets to your brain is, let me erase some of this stuff in here, is right here on the lips or the edges of that calcarine sulcus, and either cuneus or the lingual gyrus. That's right there is where the primary visual area is when you initially bring information coming in from your brainstem, from your vision, that goes to the cerebrum for conscious awareness of vision. That's the first stop right there is where it goes to. The lips of the calcarine sulcus on either the cuneus above or the lingual gyrus below. And then the next is the cingulate gyrus and sulcus. The cingulate sulcus is right here. This is the cingulate sulcus. C-shaped. Isn't that kind of C-shaped? So cingulate, think C-shaped. And that defines the border then. Here is the cingulate gyrus. There's a sulcus right here too, right above the corpus callosum, and that's called the callosal sulcus. This is the right above the corpus callosum, the callosal sulcus. I don't think I have that on the list there, but some people always ask, what's this space here? That's the callosal sulcus. This sulcus that wraps all the way around is the cingulate sulcus, which defines the borders of the cingulate gyrus. So like the inferior border of the cingulate gyrus would be the callosal sulcus. The superior border of the cingulate gyrus is the cingulate sulcus. But we could also call that, if instead of saying superior border, what could I call that? That would also be the dorsal border, because we're in this neuraxis right here in the cerebrum, and dorsal and superior synonymous here. I would probably not use dorsal in that reference, but you could use dorsal or superior. So that cingulate sulcus is dorsal or superior to cingulate gyrus, whereas the callosal sulcus is inferior or ventral to the cingulate gyrus. So and then we have the other thing we want to point out. Here's the optic chiasm is the next structure. This is your optic nerve right here, the tag end of your optic nerve. So that's going out to your eyeball out here, okay? Some of the information coming in from your vision crosses over to the other side of your brain. So some of the information from your right eye is going over to your left side of your brain, and some information coming from your left eye is going to the right side of your brain. And where they cross over is called the optic chiasm. A chiasm is a crossing point, okay? And right here, this little white, well, actually, I take that back. That's the nerve. But this little bit wider, kind of bulged part here, that's the chiasm. That's where information comes in and it crosses over from one, and then the other eye would come in and it would cross over to go, when I go back into here. But that's a crossing over point. But you can't really, it's hard to define it without having the two. When we look at the brain, well, you won't see a brain tomorrow because we've got, all of them are hemisections. But normally you see the two optic nerves coming off and they come to a point where they come together, and that's the chiasm, and then we're usually cutting right down between that chiasm. And then let's look at the brainstem and define the brainstem area here now. So this right here is our midbrain. This whole structure right here is our midbrain. This right here is our pons. This area here is medulla. Cerebellum sitting off the back here. Okay. When we look at this medial view of the midbrain, you'll see this structure here and this kind of structure here, and there's actually called the cerebral aqueduct. There's cerebral spinal fluid that goes down through there. This little area on the top is called the tectum of the midbrain. The roof. Tectum is roof. So when we get to that, when we look at the back of the midbrain, when we look at when we're viewing it from back here, we're looking at the tectum of the midbrain. That's called the roof of the midbrain. That's just why they call it the roof, because when you look at a cross section like that, it is acting like kind of like a roof, because there's a little gap or space there. That's the cerebral aqueduct where some cerebral spinal fluid goes from one ventricle to another in the middle of the brain there. How you guys doing? It's a lot of stuff, but it's not hard. It's just a lot of stuff, kind of like anatomy. Any questions before we take a break? All right. All right. Still on anatomy here. Come on. All right. So we're still on our tour of the cerebrum. Did lateral surface, medial surface. Now we're going to go to the inferior surface and just take a look at a few structures here. Now we're going to look at a whole cerebrum, so not one cut in half, and look at the whole underside of it. Just point out a couple things here. We're going to see a few cranial nerves, not all of them, but we're going to point out a couple here. The first is the olfactory bulb and tract. So that's right. This is the, oops, get back to my pen here. Okay, the bulb. Bulbs are right here. Those little structures right there. You kind of, let me erase that again. You might be able to see the lines there. Oops, kind of hard to see in this picture, but this one's kind of boogered up a little bit on this side, but it's right there's the bulb. This is the bulb here. You might on your specimens still have this olfactory bulb. That's the sensory, that has the chemoreceptors. That's what's sitting in top of your nasal cavity. That's, you got the olfactory receptors that's sensing the chemicals in the air to tell you, interpret smell. And then this is the tract. This is the axon that carries it in, and it dives right into the brain there, into the limbic system, and into your parietal lobe as well. But that's the olfactory bulb and tract on each side here. If you move the olfactory bulb and tract out of the way, and actually you can kind of see it here, that's the olfactory sulcus. Makes sense, right? There's the sulcus that this thing's kind of laying in. That's the olfactory sulcus. And if you extend this olfactory sulcus kind of out like that, it defines this gyrus here, which we don't worry about function here on that, but that's called the straight or rectus gyrus. Rectus or straight gyrus that's running straight up and down like that. Next, optic nerve, tract, and chiasm. So here is these little tag ends right here. Those are the optic nerves. These little cut ends, and those are going out to your eyeball. Like that, okay? This area right here, where some of that information crosses, this area right in here, that location, that's the optic chiasm. So optic chiasm. There's actually a little, can you see this little stalk right here? It's coming down. There's a little stalk right here pointing down. That's kind of getting in the way of our optic chiasm. That's actually called the infundibulum. And that is the connecting stalk to your pituitary gland. Your pituitary gland is actually sitting down in your skull. There's a little membrane that is over the top. So when you take a brain out, and I'll take a brain out a couple times this semester and let you guys know. So if you want to come watch or help, you don't have to, but if you want to see a brain taken out, when you pull the brain out, the pituitary gland is stuck in the skull in this little notch called the sella turcica. And then there's a little connecting stalk that goes up to the hypothalamus. This is going, the hypothalamus is up in there, that connects to your pituitary gland. That's what that little stalk is hanging down there. So, and it kind of gets in the way of seeing the optic chiasm a little bit. But once you get past the so the optic chiasm, and this is this region here, but ignoring the infundibulum right there, and then it divides into these two things here called the optic tracts. So optic nerve, chiasm, and then it turns into a tract. Kind of like roads around Dayton. Sometimes they change names as you go from one look at, but you know, so same thing with some tracks or pathways. In the optic area, you have the nerve, which is again a bundle of axons, okay? Then you have a chiasm, which contains crossing axons, and then it turns into a tract, which is just another term to describe axons. That tract eventually takes it back to a part of your thalamus is sitting back deep in here, but it takes it to a little connecting part here. Then those radiate back to your occipital lobe, and that's called the optic radiations. The radiations are also axons. Okay, so you have an optic nerve, an optic chiasm, an optic tract, and an optic radiation. There's all different parts of that communication of where going from your eyeball all the way to the brain. Okay, so that's describing all the different parts of the pathway. Don't need to know the detail now. Let's look at a gyrus down here. So there's a gyrus right here. I'm going to show you the kind of this. And on this side, it is right there. And actually, if we were to cut away the brainstem and the cerebellum here and move those out of the way, this gyrus would extend all the way back like this. You would see that gyrus go all the way back like that. And that's called the parahippocampal gyrus. The hippocampus is down. We're looking at the bottom of the temporal lobe here. Okay, so this right here, this is our temporal lobe that we're looking at, the bottom of the temporal lobe. And this parahippocampal gyrus, the hippocampus is deep in there. So that's the parahippocampal gyrus. That tends to be associated with limbic function. Limbic function is that, emotional state and also emotional control over autonomic nervous system is limbic. Anytime you hear limbic system function, think about emotional set or state and how it regulates some of our autonomic function in response to our emotional state. So, the uncus. The uncus is the most medial protrusion of the parahippocampal gyrus. So let's take a look at this one. Here's the parahippocampal gyrus. The uncus is this little bump, this most medial protrusion right here. So that's the uncus. Oops. I just point out the uncus because your oculomotor nerve, which is kind of, you can maybe see the tag end, the oculomotor nerve comes out right here of your brainstem, and that goes to your pupils to dilate, constrict your pupil, right, and also to move your eyes. In that uncus, there's a membrane here that if your brain has swelling, that uncus protrudes over the edge of a membrane called the tentorium cerebelli and pushes on the oculomotor nerve. So, when they talk about somebody, if you're examining for a head injury, if they got swelling in their brain, they say they have their pupils blown out. Well, when you block the oculomotor nerve, it causes your pupil to dilate, okay? So it can cause it to open up, okay? So that's what the uncus will push on that structure. So like if somebody's got a football game and gets injured and they go to check to see if they've got a blown pupil. If they've got a blown pupil, that means the uncus is probably pushing on the oculomotor nerve, and that means there's swelling somewhere in the cerebrum that's pushing the cerebral structures down to lower areas and making the uncus protrude over this little lip of this membrane and hit into that oculomotor nerve. Okay. Common site we call herniation, tentorial herniation. Don't worry about anterior and posterior perforated substance. It's just where some blood supply enters in, and that's just, you see, I don't know if you can see right there, some little holes right there. That's the anterior perforated substance. There's some more back in here. That's the posterior perforated substance, but I've decided you don't need to know that. That's cerebrum. You guys pretty much know all the surface anatomy of the cerebrum now. It's awesome. First day, you already know all the surface anatomy of the cerebrum. You do not have to know, you don't have to know the inferior surface for tomorrow. Tomorrow's quiz is just that lateral or medial surface of the cerebrum. Let's go through brainstem. 3 main parts: midbrain, pons, medulla. Here's the frontal view, frontal surface view. Here's the midbrain, pons, medulla. Okay, from this side, here's the midbrain from a sagittal section, pons, medulla. Sometimes it's called the full name, formal, medulla oblongata. But we just call it the medulla. Did you ever see the movie? It's been like 20, 30 years ago, Gross Anatomy. But there was an anatomy instructor, the medulla oblongata. He had an accent, Haitian accent or something. It was interesting. About a medical school. You should see it sometime. You might be able to rent it on Betamax or VCR. I don't know if they have it on Blu-ray or anything like that. So, all right. Continuing on this front ventral surface of the brainstem, there's a couple things. We're going to see some cranial nerves, and I'm just going to show you where they exit on the next slide. We pretty much cleaned off all the cranial nerves on this one. This is like just a nice clean, just to keep it as simple as possible to start with, okay? So looking at the front of the brainstem, starting in the midbrain, this area here is the midbrain, there's these structures right here called the cerebral peduncles. Cerebral peduncles. Remember, a peduncle is a connecting stock. Your brain is sitting up here, so they're kind of like the connecting stock with your brain. So that's the cerebral peduncles. It's also known as the crus cerebri or the basis pedunculi. The peduncles at the base of your brain, the basis pedunculi or the crus cerebri. Again, that's all those terminology, and depending on where you're reading, they may call it different. Interpeduncular fossa, that's this fossa right there between the peduncles, interpeduncular fossa between the two cerebral peduncles. And actually that's where your oculomotor nerves are coming out of, that interpeduncular fossa. They've been torn off though, ripped off. These guys right here are the mammillary bodies. Makes sense, mammillary, sort of what they look like there. But those have to do more with some autonomic limbic function, not real that important. I don't even list them there, but I just wanted to, a lot of people ask, what are those bumps? That's the mammillary bodies. The basilar pons and groove. The front part of the pons, when you look at the outside front part of the pons, or when you look in a sagittal view, this front part that sticks out in front like that, that's all called the basilar pons, the front part of the pons. Both on the outside surface, looking at this is called the basilar pons. And this front part here from a sagittal view, if I had said specifically a line going just to show that front part of the pons, that would be the basilar part of the pons. Okay. And then the groove. There's a groove right here. There's a little subtle groove or indentation here called the basilar groove. And what runs in that groove is the basilar artery. When we get to the arterial system, you'll see where the artery runs, and it splits off here into your two posterior cerebral arteries. But the basilar artery, vertebral arteries come up here, join in to form your basilar artery that lays right here, then that divides into your posterior cerebral arteries. But that's the basilar groove. The olives. That's these little bumps right here and right there. We're in the medulla. So the olives are in the medulla. These have connections with your cerebellum. Okay, when we start talking about cerebellar function and unconscious coordination and sensation, we'll talk about the olives and where some types of fibers that originate in some cells that originate in the olives that go and connect with your cerebellum to help process unconscious proprioception and coordination. Okay. Then the other thing we have here is the pyramids, which are these right here. They're somewhat pyramidal looking or kind of look like a triangle or pyramid upside down. So that's the pyramids. That's the very front part of the medulla. And then right down here, there's an area where there's a crossing over called the decussation of the pyramids. And that's actually where, so you have motor pathways that come down from your cerebrum, they come down to the cerebral peduncles, they come down to the basilar pons, they come down to the pyramids, then they cross over at the pyramidal decussation to go down to your spinal cord on the opposite side to become your motor lateral cortical spinal tract, a motor pathway. Okay, So that's the front part of your brainstem is mainly motor. The middle and back part is more sensory. Okay, so that's what we're looking at and why those have some relevance for us. Because that's where we're looking at the outside, but if you take cross sections through there, you'd see this pathway running down through that front part of the brainstem. Okay, and if you take a brainstem structure, I know you're getting low the battery, and you take your like a probe and you stick. This is like the ventromedian fissure here of the medulla, and you take your probe and you stick it in there and start pulling it down. Eventually you'll hit the decussation. You won't be able to pull it down any further because that's where the fibers start crossing over. And it stops right there. All I want you to appreciate from this picture is, and don't have to memorize, is you have 12 cranial nerves, pairs of cranial nerves, and that's these yellow structures, except for you have the olfactory and optic nerves up here, but then all these yellow structures that are paired, all of those together are your cranial nerves that exit from either the underneath surface of the cerebrum or the brainstem on both sides. And remember, those primarily have to do with special visual, vestibular, olfactory, special sensory function, movement of your head and neck and face, or autonomic function is what those cranial nerves collectively are doing. Back part of the brainstem, so we're looking at the back part of just the brainstem. That's the midbrain. This is the pons. This is the medulla. So here is the back part of the midbrain has these structures here. There's these round structures. You can kind of see them defined here and here. Those are called these two up here are called the superior colliculi. A colliculus is kind of like a little bump on the back. And these two down here are the inferior colliculus, or colliculi, plural. All four of those together are called the corpora quadrigemina. 4 bodies. Corpora is body, quadra is 4, corpora quadrigemina. It's the 4 bodies, those 4 colliculi, all as a group. Collectively, they're also referred to as the roof or tectum of the midbrain. Because remember in that section right here? This is a sagittal section. This is the two. There's a colliculi right here and right here. We're looking at the right side, inferior colliculi here, and superior colliculus here. But what we're looking at in that other photo, we'll go back to. We're looking at the back side. We're looking at all 4 of them on the back side that make up that tectum or roof, the midbrain. Those are relay centers for reflexive responses to your vision and hearing. So when you hear a loud sound, you quickly turn your head. Some of that information comes through your vestibular nerve, and some of that goes right to that colliculi, one of those colliculi, and then goes to your brainstem and one of your cranial nerves and tells your neck to turn really quick to check what that sound was before it even gets to your conscious awareness. Same thing with vision. Like you see something coming in from your peripheral vision that looks like a threat or maybe not, or you need to check it out. Some of that information that's coming in from your visual system, from your optic nerve, part of that goes to the superior colliculus and then goes to the brainstem, to your neck muscles, cranial nerves that control neck muscles, to tell you to look to that side, to make that quick look before it even gets to your conscious levels. That's what the colliculi are involved with. Reflex control of head and neck movement in response to visual and auditory information coming in. Trochlear nerve. It's one of your cranial nerves. I just point this one out. It's coming out right here. It's the only nerve that comes out from the back side of your brain stem. All the other cranial nerves come out from the front. It wraps around to the front, but it comes out the back. Here it is on this side. You can kind of see the tag end of it here. Okay. Normally, sitting back here is your cerebellum, right? Your cerebellum sits off the back side of the brainstem. This area right here is your pons. It's sitting off the pons. It's connected to the pons, back of the pons, but we've cut it off. So we've moved the cerebellum out of the way, and you see the remnants of where you cut it off. So where you cut it off is actually the connecting stalks or connections to the brainstem of the cerebellum are called the peduncles. Just like we had the cerebral peduncles right here that connect the brainstem to the cerebrum, we have cerebellar peduncles that connect the brainstem to the cerebellum. And they are these. This area right here, here, and here. And on this side, it's this, this, and this. When you cut the cerebellum off, if you angle the cuts just right, you'd end up dividing it into 3 separate parts or connecting areas. So you have what's called the superior, so this is the superior cerebellar peduncle. This one's the middle, and this one is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay? They all work together to connect the cerebellum to the back of your, to your pons there, to your brainstem. But if you cut them at the right angle, there's actually 3 distinct pathways or tracks that connect your cerebellum. So there's information coming between your brainstem and your cerebellum, and eventually some of that goes up to your cerebrum, some goes down your spinal cord, but that's how information and axons are being, are communicating and going through those cerebellar peduncles, okay? Remember I talked about that rhomboid fossa earlier? So that's, oops. When you cut the cerebellum off here, there's a little bit of membrane right here, but you can actually cut that out. And then you'll see this is the rhomboid fossa. So it's rhomboid in shape, it's a depression, and it's kind of both in the top part of it is mostly up in the pons, and then the little bottom part of it here, this tag end, is down more into the medulla, but that's called the rhomboid fossa. That rhomboid fossa, this is a space, and there's cerebrospinal fluid in there. We're going to show you some ventricles here in a second, but this rhomboid fossa, if you're looking at it there, it becomes the floor of your 4th ventricle. Okay, it's called the 4th ventricle, but becomes the rhomboid fossa is the floor of the 4th ventricle. Then we have some things called tubercles down in the medulla. So this is in the medulla. You got to kind of imagine them. You got to see them and feel them a little bit, but they're right here. There's a tubercle there. There's a little tiny tubercle there, a little one here, and there's a little one right there. Let me erase those again so you can kind of visualize without the lines. They're barely perceptible, but there's a little bump right there, a little bump right there, a little bump right here, and a little bump out here. Okay? Those are the gracile and cuneate tubercles. The gracile tubercles are the ones that are more medial. The cuneate tubercles are out here, a little more lateral. Don't have to know this now, but I'm just going to show you what they're for. So when you have, they are a relay area. They're a group of, there's underneath those tubercles, deep underneath those tubercles is a little group of nuclei or cell bodies, okay? And what happens is when you have sensory information, in particular proprioceptive information about where your body is in position in space, so if I can tell if somebody's moving my foot up or down or my hand is moving a certain direction or where that information comes up the back part of your spinal cord. It comes from the peripheral receptors, comes up the back part of your spinal cord, and it comes up the back part of your brainstem. And if it's coming from your legs, it comes up this more medial part. Then it makes a connection in just deep to the gracile tubercle in an area called the gracile nucleus. So the nucleus gracilis or gracile nucleus is just deep to that gracile tubercle. The tubercle is the external feature. The nucleus is what you see in a cross-section. When you look at a cross-section, you see the actual cell bodies. That's the gracile nucleus. Information comes up. It makes a synapse, and there's some cell bodies. And once it synapses, it actually crosses over, goes up the other side, and goes to the other side of your brain. So sensory information and motor information crosses in the nervous system. It's a contralateral pathway, but that is just one of the stopping over areas for that pathway. Okay. And then the cuneate nucleus, That's information coming in from your, oh, my pen finally died on me. That's a signal to be done for the day. The gracil nucleus, let me see if I can use, you can't see, oh, you can kind of, can you see my cursor on here? A little bit. The cuneate tubercle, just deep to that is the cuneate nucleus, and that's the relay for proprioceptive information coming from your upper body. Gracil, I think of the gracilis muscle, okay? And so I know that the gracil nucleus and tubercle are associated with lower body. Cuneate, you just got to remember it's going to be upper body because the gracil takes care of lower body. So but that's for purpose. Don't need to know all that detail now. All you need to know is that's those two bumps. But eventually we'll get there. When we get to the sensory system, we'll talk about the pathways. That ain't going to work. Cerebellum, real quick. Primary function of the cerebellum. First of all, look at this cross section, the sagittal section, that top picture. Look how kind of all the sulci and ridges and layering going on there. So do you guys know what the purpose of, have you ever been told what the purpose of why your brain kind of dives in on itself and has all those sulci and so forth? Does anybody know what that ends up helps you do or helps your brain do? It has to do with you have limited space in your skull, right? You only have so much space. So what it does is if you have these invaginations and sulci and depressions is it gives you more, if you make it wrinkly, you have more surface area. So if I took the cortex of your brain and I smushed it and flattened it out, it would be really, really big, even though it's in a pretty small, because it wrinkles in on itself. So the more wrinkles you have, the more surface area and all those wrinkles that you have to process information, to have more cell bodies that can communicate and talk and interact and process information. The cerebellum is even more wrinkly than the cerebral cortex. Cerebellum is processing massive amounts of sensory information. It's your error detection system. It's like your anti-lock brakes in your car. It's detecting movement unconsciously as you're moving, and if you're making mistakes or the movement you intended to do doesn't match the movement that occurred, it'll help send another signal or alter the next motor signal coming down to tweak it so it smooths it out, dampens it, makes it look more coordinated. So it does that for both your muscles that move your legs, your up arms, your trunk, even of your eyes. So the cerebellum has connections with the extraocular muscles. So it smooths out and coordinates motor activity unconsciously, but a lot of processing has to go on there. It has an anterior lobe. I'm going to, if you see my pointer here, the anterior lobe is this area right here. This is the little sulcus here that divides the anterior lobe from this big, huge posterior lobe. If you're looking from this is the picture just below the sagittal section, that's a top view of it, of the cerebellum. And then this picture on the lower left, that is a anterior front view of it. And you can see, remember those little connecting peduncles? These are the cerebellar peduncles where there's been cut off from the back of the pons, is what we're looking at there. We'll stop there, I think. We're done. My pen ran out, so it'd be better if I can sort of draw on some of the stuff. So let me just escape here. How far are we here? Let me just